In a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the mornings began with the distant hum of car engines and the soft laughter of children heading to school, there lived a boy who would soon challenge the very boundaries of human understanding. He was 10 years old, an age when most children are consumed by the simplicity of playgrounds and cartoons, yet within him lay a curiosity so profound that it quietly defied the limits of what even seasoned scientists had struggled with for decades. His name was Liam, a child of ordinary circumstances, living in an ordinary house, yet harboring an extraordinary mind. From a very early age, Liam exhibited an unusual attentiveness. While other children fiddled with toys, he would watch the patterns of shadows dancing across his bedroom wall or trace the intricate lattice of veins in a leaf, silently asking questions the answers to which lay far beyond his years. His parents, though loving and supportive, initially mistook his curiosity for mere daydreaming. Yet there was a method to his wandering gaze, a precision in the way his fingers would trace shapes and numbers, as if he were already solving unseen equations in his mind. School for Liam was both a playground and a laboratory. While his peers scribbled answers to arithmetic problems, he would linger over the questions, exploring them from angles no textbook had ever suggested. It was during these quiet moments, in the middle of a sunlit classroom where dust motes floated lazily through the air, that Liam's mind began to approach the impossible. The problem that had stymied generations of scholars, the intricate mathematical puzzle of patterns in prime numbers, was known to have resisted every attempt at solution for decades. Professors had spent lifetimes on it, publishing papers filled with complex theorems and abstract logic, yet the answer remained elusive. To Liam, however, it was simply a puzzle waiting to be understood. His approach was neither methodical nor hurried. He sketched diagrams across the margins of his notebooks, whispered sequences of numbers to himself as he walked the hallways, and occasionally stared at the ceiling as if the very angles of the room whispered secrets only he could decipher. There was a rhythm to his thinking, a quiet music of logic and intuition entwined, that defied conventional education and challenged assumptions about intelligence and experience. At home, his small room reflected the dual nature of his life, toys scattered across the floor, remnants of a typical childhood, juxtaposed with stacks of books and scribbled pages filled with complex numerical sequences. His mother would sometimes peek in, worried he was lost in daydreams, yet unaware that her son was quietly bridging the gap between curiosity and genius. Dinner conversations would drift from school anecdotes to the strange ideas Liam would toss into the air, ideas that seemed nonsensical at first, yet later revealed the seeds of revolutionary thought. One particular evening, under the golden haze of the setting sun, Liam sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, a worn notebook open before him. The problem that had defeated some of the world's brightest minds stared back at him like a challenge, not with intimidation but with invitation. His pencil moved swiftly, almost instinctively, guided not by rote formulas but by an innate understanding of patterns and logic. Time passed unnoticed. The distant ticking of a clock became irrelevant. Outside, the neighborhood settled into quiet twilight, unaware that inside this modest room, history was being quietly written by hands too small to hold the weight of such a revelation. And then, in a moment that would later be described as almost mystical, Liam paused. He leaned back, eyes wide, not fully comprehending the magnitude of what he had just done. The solution lay there in front of him, simple in its elegance yet profound in its implications. What no PhD could solve in decades, this 10-year-old had uncovered in a few days of intuitive exploration. He had made a discovery that would ripple across scientific journals, conference halls, and classrooms around the world, though at that very moment, Liam only felt a quiet sense of satisfaction, untainted by the recognition that would soon follow. This was the story of a child whose mind could see what experts could not, a mind unburdened by preconceptions, driven by wonder and destined to rewrite history. The world had yet to understand the significance of his achievement, but the first steps had already been taken, in the dim glow of a small bedroom where innocence met brilliance in a single, timeless moment. For decades, the problem Liam was about to solve had haunted the world's most brilliant minds. Hidden in the dusty archives of university libraries, in thick journals of abstract mathematics and theoretical physics, lay the details of a puzzle that had resisted solution through years, even generations of relentless effort. Scholars had tried everything: complex algorithms, computational simulations, and countless proofs that crumbled under scrutiny. Conferences would echo with heated debates, professors scribbling furiously on chalkboards, all struggling to reach the elusive answer. And yet, the solution remained stubbornly out of reach, a ghost haunting the corridors of academia. The problem, simple to describe yet fiendishly complex to resolve, had origins that stretched back over half a century. It was a question that bridged disciplines, part number theory, part combinatorial analysis, part logic that even the most seasoned mathematicians admitted was near impossible to unravel. The proofs and theories generated by PhDs, postdoctoral researchers, and even Nobel laureates were vast, yet none had fully captured the elegance or simplicity the solution required. For decades, this problem had become a silent benchmark of intellectual endurance, a rite of passage for any scholar who dared to confront it. Universities treated it with reverence and frustration in equal measure. Professors would reminisce about their first attempts, recalling nights spent poring over papers, hands trembling as they scribbled calculations that led nowhere. One eminent mathematician, speaking at a seminar, had once described it as a wall of numbers that reflects the very limits of human reasoning. The challenge had grown almost mythical over the years. Students and academics alike would whisper about it, some claiming they could feel its impossibility like a weight pressing down on their consciousness. It was a problem designed to humble even the most confident intellects. And yet the world had approached it with a particular rigidity. Experts brought with them decades of assumptions, formal methods, and established frameworks. They dissected every angle, applied every theorem, and yet remained trapped by the very structure of their own knowledge. What made this problem so extraordinary was not merely its difficulty, but the way it resisted conventional thinking. It demanded a perspective that no PhD had yet considered, a mental flexibility that was as rare as genius itself. Liam, of course, had none of this baggage. To him, the problem was not an intimidating fortress but a curious puzzle, like the intricate patterns he had noticed in nature. Where adults saw impossibility, he saw opportunity. Where seasoned scholars had been constrained by methodical logic, Liam approached it with intuition, imagination, and fearless curiosity. He was not burdened by fear of failure, reputation, or the weight of history. His mind wandered freely, exploring avenues that had been dismissed as irrelevant or impossible, often sketching diagrams and sequences in ways that looked chaotic to an outsider, but in reality formed a map of understanding unique to his cognition. The historical context of this puzzle added to its mystique. During its 50-year lifespan, countless theories had emerged and collapsed. Scholars had published articles, each claiming progress only to be disproven, leading to cycles of hope and disappointment. International conferences dedicated entire panels to it, where experts would argue passionately, sometimes fiercely, over subtle nuances that seemed trivial to anyone but those immersed in the field. The problem had become a touchstone of intellectual pride, a challenge that defined careers and academic legacies. Yet for Liam, the weight of history was invisible. He approached the challenge as a child approaches a maze, with curiosity as his guide and intuition as his compass. His perspective was fresh, untainted by the conventional methods that had constrained others for decades. And it was this innocence, this unassuming clarity of thought, that would eventually become his greatest advantage. In the quiet corners of his home, with the hum of everyday life continuing around him, Liam's mind worked tirelessly. He scribbled sequences, drew connections, and rearranged concepts in ways that would seem illogical to a trained scholar. Yet each step brought him closer, incrementally, to a revelation that had eluded the brightest minds of the world. It was a slow, deliberate dance between pattern recognition and intuitive insight, a process that seemed almost effortless in its grace, though it was in fact the culmination of an extraordinary intellect at work. And so the stage was set. Decades of human effort had created a backdrop of impossibility, a wall of intellectual challenge towering over anyone who dared to approach it. Within this framework of history, expectation, and frustration, a 10-year-old boy was about to take a step that would alter the course of scholarly pursuit forever. The mystery had endured, a shadow looming over generations of thinkers, and now, without fanfare, it was quietly awaiting a solution that would come from the most unlikely of sources. The quiet of Liam's room had become a universe of thought. The walls, once mere boundaries of a child's bedroom, had transformed into a mental cosmos where numbers and patterns danced in invisible constellations only he could see. Here, amidst scattered notebooks and half-erased sketches, the impossible problem that had baffled PhDs for decades became a living puzzle, shifting and transforming as Liam traced its hidden contours with a child's fearless curiosity. It began, as it always did for him, with observation. He didn't approach the problem as scholars did, with rigid formulas or step-by-step logical constructions. Instead, he observed the numbers as if they were living things, each one pulsing with subtle relationships, whispering secrets to anyone patient enough to notice. Hours blurred into each other as he moved between the familiar and the unknown, a silent rhythm guiding his thoughts. Occasionally he would pause, tapping a pencil against his lips, staring at the ceiling, eyes wide and unfocused. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like daydreaming, but in that silence, his mind was threading connections invisible to every expert who had come before him. Then, as if by chance, the first hint of clarity emerged. A small, seemingly insignificant pattern, overlooked by generations of scholars, caught his attention. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a shift in the sequence, a tiny anomaly that didn't fit the accepted methods. But Liam, with his unburdened perspective, didn't see it as an anomaly. He saw possibility. His pencil moved quickly now, sketching diagrams, connecting numbers in ways that looked chaotic on paper, but formed a coherent framework in his mind. The child's hands moved with uncanny precision, guided by intuition rather than learned rules, translating his understanding into a language that had remained inaccessible to decades of advanced study. Minutes stretched into hours, yet Liam remained absorbed, unaware of the passage of time. Outside, the world carried on, cars humming past, neighbors' voices drifting through the evening air. But inside this small room, a historic breakthrough was quietly taking shape. And then, as he leaned over one final diagram, the puzzle seemed to collapse in on itself, all the loose ends snapping together with a quiet inevitability. The realization came slowly at first, like a sunrise creeping over the horizon. Liam froze, pencil hovering above the page. The answer lay before him, simple, elegant, and profound. It wasn't just a solution, it was a revelation, a perspective so fresh that it made the decades of scholarly struggle appear almost tragic in its futility. For a moment, he didn't fully comprehend the magnitude of what he had done. He had approached the impossible not as a problem to be conquered, but as a puzzle to be understood. And in doing so, he had done what generations of PhDs could not. He had solved it. There was no dramatic exclamation, no sudden celebration. Instead, there was a quiet awe, a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. Liam looked around his room as if expecting someone to appear and tell him it was a mistake, but there was no one. The realization was his alone, intimate and unadorned. In that instant, the world's understanding of the impossible shifted, and yet the boy himself remained grounded in the simplicity of his discovery. His process had been a combination of innocence and brilliance. Where adults relied on years of accumulated knowledge, Liam relied on wonder. Where experts were constrained by expectation and precedent, he moved freely, connecting dots that no one had even considered. It was accidental in the sense that he didn't understand the historical significance yet, but intentional in every movement of his mind. He was the first to see a path that had remained invisible to the finest intellects, simply because he saw the world differently. And so, in the quiet of a small bedroom illuminated by the soft glow of a desk lamp, history had been made. A 10-year-old had glimpsed what the world's greatest minds could not, bridging the chasm between genius and intuition, and in doing so, redefined what it meant to truly understand. This was a moment that would ripple outward, first through scientific verification, then through disbelief, and finally into awe. The accidental genius had arrived, unheralded, and yet poised to leave an indelible mark on the annals of human achievement. News travels in strange ways, and in the modern age, no discovery, no matter how small or monumental, remains hidden for long. Yet the ripple caused by a 10-year-old solution to a decades-old unsolvable problem was unlike anything the scientific world had ever witnessed. At first, disbelief dominated. Emails exchanged between renowned mathematicians carried tones of skepticism, incredulity, and polite caution. How could a child, barely out of elementary school, achieve what the most esteemed minds of generations could not? The claim alone seemed absurd, almost fantastical. Universities that had once dedicated entire conferences to this problem suddenly found their halls filled with quiet speculation. Professors, seated behind polished oak desks or standing before chalkboards dense with equations, reread papers, recalculated results, and double-checked references. Their seasoned eyes scanned the solution, at first expecting a mistake, a misstep, a typo. But the more they examined it, the more undeniable it became. The work was correct, elegant, brilliant in a simplicity that only a mind unburdened by decades of training could produce. Abs in offices across the globe, a pattern emerged. Initial skepticism gave way to astonishment. Emails multiplied, phone calls were made. Scholars convened emergency meetings, sharing PDFs and annotated notes, often whispering with a mix of awe and disbelief. Some were cautious, fearing the solution might crumble under scrutiny, yet each verification, each calculation, only confirmed what Liam had achieved in the quiet of his bedroom. The impossible had been done, and by a child. Meanwhile, the young prodigy remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering beyond his walls. For Liam, it was still a puzzle completed, a challenge met, a personal triumph. He did not yet understand that the world was beginning to tilt in response to his insight. It was only when a curious reporter, tipped off by a local teacher who had seen Liam's sketches, arrived at his home with a notebook in hand that the first public glimpse of the solution emerged. Liam explained in the unassuming clarity of a child the steps he had taken, the patterns he had noticed, and the logic that had guided him. The reporter, initially expecting confusion or hesitation, instead found an articulate, confident, and surprisingly humble mind. The media frenzy followed almost immediately. Headlines around the globe highlighted the astonishing fact. A 10-year-old had solved a problem that had resisted the combined efforts of the world's greatest intellects. News outlets filled their screens with footage of Liam's quiet room, of sketches and diagrams that seemed impossibly complex yet resonated with elegance. Social media erupted with wonder, memes, and discussions, some incredulous, some reverent. Interviews were scheduled with mathematicians, scientists, and even historians, all attempting to contextualize the achievement for the world. Academia responded with a mixture of pride, envy, and profound respect. Journals rushed to verify, replicate, and publish the solution, often accompanying the papers with commentaries praising the fresh perspective and intuition that only a mind free from entrenched methods could produce. Scholars reflected on the lesson embedded in Liam's breakthrough, that brilliance is not always the product of experience, that insight can emerge from innocence, and that sometimes the eyes untrained in the weight of convention see truths hidden from the most learned minds. And yet, amid all this attention, Liam remained largely untouched by fame. While the world debated, applauded, and marveled, he continued his quiet life, solving problems, observing patterns, and walking the delicate line between childhood wonder and historical impact. This juxtaposition, the innocence of the boy against the astonishment of the world, became a central theme of his story. It was a reminder that genius often arrives unannounced, and that its impact is measured not by the awareness of the achiever, but by the resonance it leaves in the wider world. The recognition, as it eventually came, was both overwhelming and profoundly moving. Invitations to speak at conferences, letters of congratulations from Nobel laureates, and news coverage in prominent scientific journals all arrived. Yet Liam approached it all with a quiet humility. To him, the puzzle had been a question to explore, not a stage to shine upon. And perhaps that was why he succeeded where others had not. His mind approached the impossible not with pressure or expectation, but with pure curiosity, the kind that transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. In the span of a few weeks, the world had shifted its perception of intelligence, discovery, and potential. The narrative that expertise was the sole path to profound achievement was challenged by the simple truth that a 10-year-old child, unaware of the historical stakes, had seen what no PhD could see, and in doing so, had reminded humanity of the boundless possibilities hidden within curiosity and wonder. History rarely announces itself in real time. More often, it unfolds quietly, its significance recognized only in hindsight. Yet Liam's breakthrough refused to remain silent. Within weeks of its verification, the academic world began to acknowledge what it was witnessing, not merely a solved problem, but a turning point. The solution did more than close a decades-old question. It opened new pathways of thought, reshaping how scholars approached complexity, intuition, and the limits of human reasoning. Scientific journals moved swiftly. Papers analyzing Liam's method appeared alongside editorials that bordered on philosophical reflection. Professors who had once struggled with the problem now stood before lecture halls, explaining how a child's perspective had illuminated what advanced frameworks had obscured. The elegance of the solution became its most celebrated feature, not because it was simple, but because it revealed how unnecessarily complicated human thinking had become. In one stroke, Liam's work dismantled assumptions that intelligence must always follow hierarchy, training, and age. Across the world, research institutions began re-evaluating their approaches. Think tanks debated whether traditional academic pathways inadvertently suppressed creative insight. Educational experts questioned long-held beliefs about how and when brilliance emerges. Liam's discovery became a case study not only in mathematics, but in cognition itself. How many other breakthroughs, scholars wondered, were waiting behind walls of convention? How many voices had been silenced by the assumption that genius must look a certain way? The public response was no less profound. Newspapers framed the story as a modern parable, a reminder that history's greatest shifts often come from the margins. Parents saw hope in their children's curiosity. Teachers felt both inspiration and responsibility, realizing that potential often hides behind unconventional thinking. The story crossed cultural and national boundaries, resonating with a universal truth that human potential is not bound by age, status, or credentials. Recognition followed, though carefully measured. Academic societies extended honorary acknowledgements rarely granted to anyone so young. Invitations arrived from institutions that had once been untouchable symbols of intellectual authority. Yet Liam's presence at these events was striking not for grandeur, but for humility. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing the conversations of scholars who now studied his work as carefully as sacred text. When asked how he felt about making history, his answers remained disarmingly simple. He had only wanted to understand the puzzle. Behind the scenes, historians began drawing comparisons. They spoke of rare moments when an individual shifted the trajectory of knowledge, when a single insight altered decades of thinking. Liam's name began appearing alongside those moments, not as a prodigy story alone, but as evidence that human progress often depends on perspectives unshaped by tradition. His discovery became a reminder that innovation is not always forged through experience, but sometimes through innocence paired with deep curiosity. What truly defined this moment, however, was not fame or accolades. It was the quiet recalibration of belief. The academic world, long governed by rigid structures, had been forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Expertise without openness can become blindness. Liam had succeeded not by knowing more, but by assuming less. His work challenged the notion that progress must always be incremental, proving instead that leaps are possible when minds are free to wander without fear of being wrong. As months passed, the language around the discovery shifted. It was no longer described merely as a solution, but as a catalyst. New research built upon its framework. Young students cited it as inspiration. Scholars referenced it as a reminder to revisit forgotten assumptions. The ripple had become a wave, and history, slowly but unmistakably, was taking shape around a moment born in a child's quiet room. In the grand timeline of human understanding, Liam's achievement marked a rare convergence of brilliance and innocence. It was not just a chapter added to scientific history, it was a line drawn across it, separating what humanity once believed about intelligence from what it could no longer ignore. History was no longer something written only by the experienced and the credentialed. It had been rewritten by a 10-year-old who simply dared to look at the world differently. Long after the headlines faded and the academic debates settled into textbooks and lecture notes, the true significance of Liam's achievement continued to unfold in quieter, more profound ways. History would remember the solution, the equations, and the impossible problem finally laid to rest. But beneath the mathematics lay something far more enduring, a shift in how humanity understood brilliance itself. Liam did not grow overnight into the figure the world expected him to become. He remained, at his core, a child shaped not by ambition but by curiosity. While institutions debated how best to nurture his future, he continued to ask questions with the same unguarded wonder that had guided him from the beginning. He learned, slowly and deliberately, that his discovery was no longer just his own. It belonged to the world now, woven into the collective understanding of human potential. Educators across continents began referencing his story not as a miracle, but as a lesson. They spoke of the danger of overstructuring young minds, of silencing unconventional thought in favor of standardized answers. Liam's legacy challenged classrooms to become spaces of exploration rather than instruction alone. His work reminded teachers that sometimes the most powerful insights emerge not from mastery, but from play, from curiosity allowed to roam without fear of failure. In academic circles, the impact was equally transformative. Researchers began revisiting abandoned ideas, questioning assumptions once considered unshakable. Liam's solution became a quiet reminder embedded in scholarly culture, that complexity does not always demand complexity in return. His innocence had not been a weakness, it had been his greatest strength. Where experts had been constrained by tradition, he had been liberated by not knowing what was impossible. Public memory softened his story into something almost mythic. Parents told it to children as proof that their thoughts mattered. Young students saw in him a reflection of themselves, not a distant genius, but a reminder that insight could come from anyone willing to observe deeply. His name became shorthand for a universal truth, that history is not shaped only by power or preparation, but by perspective. As years passed, Liam's own understanding of his place in history matured. He came to recognize that his greatest contribution was not the solution itself, but the door it opened. A door to humility and expertise. A door to curiosity and education. A door to the idea that humanity's future breakthroughs might come from places long overlooked. In quiet moments when the world's attention drifted elsewhere, Liam often returned to the habits that had defined him from the start, observing patterns, asking questions without urgency, letting his mind wander where others feared to go. These moments, unseen and undocumented, were perhaps the truest continuation of his legacy. They were proof that brilliance, when rooted in innocence, does not burn out, it deepens. History would record the facts, the age, the problem, the solution, but what endured beyond record was the reminder his story etched into human consciousness, that knowledge is not owned by the few, that genius does not ask permission, and that sometimes the future of understanding arrives quietly in a small room, carried by hands too young to know they are holding history. In the end, Liam did not just solve a problem. He solved a misconception. He revealed that the limits we assign to intelligence are often illusions, built not by reality, but by expectation. His legacy was not confined to equations or accolades. It lived on in every mind newly willing to question, to imagine, and to believe that even the impossible might yield to a curious gaze. And so the story closed not with applause, but with reflection. A 10-year-old, unaware of the weight of history, had changed its direction, not through force or fame, but through innocence paired with insight. A reminder, timeless and quiet, that the greatest revolutions often begin with a simple question, and the courage to look at it differently.